The maximum resolution of the N64 is actually 640 by 480, which happens to be the same resolution that the Wii supports. For 3 generations, Nintendo did not increase the maximum resolution of their consoles. Even though the N64 could support this resolution, no games used it. And there's good reason why. For my team's Game Jam entry this year, we made a game that we called Destroy, which is kind of inspired by Rampage. You're a giant Godzilla going around in the city destroying buildings. And the one that destroys the most buildings, or rather the most points from destroying buildings, wins. The taller buildings are worth more. And while there's nothing groundbreaking about the graphics or anything I'm trying to do with the N64 with this, we did try to push the maximum resolution of this game. So we went with the full 640 by 480 frame buffer. And well, when you do this, the frame rate isn't great. It goes about 10 frames per second. One optimization that Pyrozine suggested, why not just redraw the things that move? Because the camera's at a fixed angle, if something doesn't move, then it doesn't need to be redrawn. In theory, it could save a lot of frame buffer time. And why would that work in theory? Well, it's because the N64 is very limited on memory bandwidth. A shocking amount of time on the N64 is spent just copying data from the GPU to the memory. Anytime you could save copying data to the frame buffer could help render frames faster. There's a couple things you can do here. One, you can disable the Z buffer. That's actually one thing I did in my Mega Textures demo. I knew there'd be a lot of time spent copying data from the RAM into the GPU to render each individual tile. There's more details about that, I'll link it here. Long story short, by not using the Z buffer, it cuts the amount of data you have to write by half, and you also don't need to read from the Z buffer, which is a huge performance gain. I didn't go with that option for this game entry because I'd need to properly sort things and put them in the right order, which maybe if I had more time and I wanted to really optimize this, I would have, but I didn't. And it's totally a viable technique because, well, it turns out PlayStation 1 didn't have a Z buffer. And so the PlayStation actually had to draw things from back to front in order to have things show up in the correct order. The N64 has the Z buffer, but it does come at a cost. The technique I decided to try was to only redraw the sections that changed. One complication though, there's actually 2 frame buffers. When rendering graphics, things are being drawn one thing at a time. And if what you were drawing to is visible at the screen at all times, you would see flashing as things are erased and redrawn every single frame. To fight this, games use a technique called double buffering. So a buffer, just a section of memory, so you have 2 of them. One buffer is being drawn to currently, and when the contents of that buffer are finished being drawn to, you flip it to be the one that's being displayed. And so that's what's actually showing up to the screen. And it can sit there any number of V-blank intervals or refreshes of the screen until you have the next frame prepared, at which point you swap them. You're always just doing that swap back and forth. And since now there's actually 2 buffers of memory with stuff drawn to them, I actually need to keep track of 2 frames worth of positions of objects. So when I draw things to this buffer, I also mark where in the buffer they have been drawn to. So when that buffer comes back to be reused, I know all the places that need to be erased from in order to correctly draw the next frame. And so what does it look like to actually clear the buffer? Clearing the buffer, in this case, is really just drawing the background. And that never changes. So what I ended up doing is I rendered all of that to a single off-screen texture, the size of the frame buffer. So now I actually have a 3rd frame buffer. And when I had to clear a section of the screen, I simply copy the image data from this pre-rendered background into the frame buffer. And that erases everything in that square. Now that this section is being erased, redraw everything that touches that square. But things like the tanks, the bullets, and the player, those are just redrawn every frame no matter what. But the buildings spend most of the time sitting still. And so it would be wasteful to be redrawing them if they didn't need it. So I actually kept track. If a clearing rectangle ever covered up a building, I would redraw the building. Otherwise, I wouldn't. That saves some cycles. The buildings actually would be redrawn every frame if they themselves were moving, but that was only as they're being damaged or collapsing. And that worked pretty well. There's actually one other problem to solve here though. As buildings collapse, they go into the ground. But as I mentioned before, I'm actually pre-drawing the ground into this off-screen buffer. And so when I copy over the data, the Z buffer is not being updated for that region. So I actually first draw a solid color polygon, or just a single square, that covers the same area as the ground, but has the same Z buffer layer. So I do that first, and then I copy over the image data to cover that up. This is actually a pretty commonly used technique on the N64. Ocarina of Time did it for all their pre-rendered areas where it looks all pre-rendered and pretty, but you can walk behind certain objects. That's because they had those objects drawn first to update the Z buffer, and then they draw the pre-rendered scene over the top of that. So you both get the Z buffer update and the exact image you want. How well did this technique work? Well, it seems like I could have gotten more out of this. I think there are performance bottlenecks and other places that I should have addressed, but it did improve performance, which is at least a win. You can see when I have no optimization and I'm just redrawing the screen every frame, I start at around 10 frames a second. And inevitably, as the number of buildings decrease, the performance does improve, which I think shows to me that maybe I could have sought some performance improvements there. But when I apply this technique, I get a few more frames of performance. It wasn't stellar. After recording the video, I realized I really couldn't just let it go without at least trying to do no Z buffer. I tinkered with Tiny3D a little bit to try to turn off the depth buffer globally. As far as I could tell, the depth buffer setting is baked into each individual material, and I just wanted to turn it off globally to see what it would do. And well, this was the result. I'm not sure what's going on with those weird colors, but it does show about what performance I'd get if I did manage to turn it off, which is a lot less than I thought. Even if I did this, I'd have to solve a few new problems. One, I'd have to actually Z-sort, which I'm not doing here, so things will go on top of each other in the wrong order. But two, I'd have to make it so the buildings would not be rendered once they're underground. So you can see as buildings collapse in this clip here, they just move down, but they're not being covered up by the ground because there's no Z buffer to do that. After this first test, I decided it really wasn't worth trying to push this idea any further and just leave it as is. The winners have been announced, so I figured I'd plug them here. Third place was Hydra Harmonics. This game had a lot of charm and would feel right in place in a Mario Party game. Second place was Space Waves. This game looked incredible. It almost looks too good to be on the N64. First place was Coin Rush, which fully deserved it. I think it looks great, plays great, and it feels like a polished game, which is fitting because the maker plans on turning it into a standalone game. Check out their channel here. You may have noticed this is the creator of Tiny3D, which I am using for my project, so huge shout out to Hail to Dodongo for their work. Our game was a close fourth. If you want to play these games, a link to the ROM that has all the minigames will be in the description so you can check them out. Most emulators won't run them since it uses LibDragon. I'd recommend Ares, although you'll need a powerful computer to run all of them at full speed. Ideally, you just use a flash card and run on original hardware. I just want to say thank you all for watching this video, and also thank you to the Patreon supporters of this channel. Names here. It's small, I'm hoping to grow this, but I do appreciate the support. And until next time, take care. You can do a direct memory copy where the GPU does not transform the pickles, does not transform the pickles, which does not transform the pixels.